About constitutionalism and how it develops in England. This is a totally different concept than what we talked about with the absolute monarchy developing in France and then later in Austria and then later in Russia if you finish reading that chapter. But constitutionalism is very different. The system that develops in England, and it has, like we said, it doesn't happen overnight. It has a long sort of build up that can go all the way back to really about 1215 or so. So let's take a look at the development of constitutionalism in England. We can trace it back to this idea. Constitutionalism really means limiting the power of the king. In 1215, the English barons, landowners revolted against King John and essentially forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. And what it really was is a document that forced the king to obey the law, that the king was not above the law. It's really a contract between the king and the landowners, and that the king had to obey the law. Okay, and it limits the power of the king. That's a big difference than what we just talked about with absolute monarchy, where there are no limits to the power of the king. The other thing that limited English kings was the development of Parliament. About 1295 or so, you see the beginnings of Parliament in England. The Parliament is a body, all right, that is a representative sample of, in this case, in England, the landowners. Don't think that Parliament represented everybody in England. It didn't. It only represented the wealthy, the landowning classes, the very powerful. But it is a representative body, and the king had to ask for the approval of the Parliament for some of these these things that the king needed, like taxes. So there's two things that really limited the power of the monarchy in England. The By the time you get to the beginnings really of this period that we're talking about, for example, with Elizabeth's reign in England, you're starting to talk about the early 1600s or so. You have Parliament who has the power to tax, can debate, can pass laws with the king's and queen's approval, but there is the monarch who also has some power over foreign policy, and they're really a team. But Elizabeth dies in 1603. She doesn't have any legitimate heirs because she never married. And so, what happens in England is you have the rise of some new monarchs, okay, the Stuarts. And they are Elizabeth's closest relatives. And they will become the new family in charge of the English monarchy. And they're different. Okay. Rather than work with Parliament as a team, you're going to see them get caught up in what's going on in most of Europe. They want to be absolute monarchs. James I, who becomes King of England in 1603 and will rule until 1625. His son, Charles, who will rule from 1625 to 1649. They were both really believers in divine right. And divine right is where is one of the things that absolute monarchy hangs their hat on. They believe that God has given them the right to rule. James becomes King of England in 1603. He doesn't really like the English. He doesn't really know anything about the English. All he knows is that when he comes to address the House of Commons, when he comes to address Parliament, he says, look, I don't like this. I should be the one in charge, not talking to a group of people who think they have power. I should have all of the power. So James really would like to be more powerful. He really wants to be absolute, okay, and he doesn't want to work with Parliament. His son Charles won't want to work with him either, okay, but he does have some major problems. He has a lot of debt. He wasn't English. He did believe in divine right. He probably had some pro-Catholic sympathies, and as a result, he clashed with Parliament often. But England is becoming a world power. England has established colonies here in America. Jamestown's been established. And so England is becoming a world power. Remember mercantilism we talked about last time also applies to the English. They want to be an economic power. They need colonies for raw materials. And so James, in some ways, has to work with Parliament, but he doesn't like it. His son, Charles, hates it even more. Okay. He loved ceremony. He loved ritual. He loved the pomp and circumstance that surrounded being king. He was seen really as too Catholic by the Puritans, this group inside of the Church of England that wanted to purify the Church of England. Charles does not want Parliament in the way. He will actually send Parliament home. Charles, when Parliament wouldn't give Charles any money to fight wars or taxes to fund his wars, Charles sends them home. And he's going to try to rule England without Parliament. So he's trying to become that absolute monarch by getting rid of some of these limitations on the power of the king. So Charles is trying his best to become that absolute monarch. He messes up. He gets involved in a war in Scotland and he needs money. So he says that he's going to give up some of these things. He's going to allow some rights, but he doesn't mean it. Okay. And he signs the petition of rights that was sent to him by Parliament, then ignores it, sends Parliament home, has no intention of calling it back. But he gets involved in this war in Scotland. Things turn bad for him, and he has to call Parliament back to session in 1640 because he needs money and he needs to fight this war. The Parliament says, look, if you're going to call us back into session, we want you to agree to call us into session at least once every 3 years. Once every 3 years. We want you to be able to, or we want to be able to come into session at least every 3 years and you not send us home for these long periods of time. Charles doesn't like it, basically tries to disband Parliament. What results is the Civil War. From 1642 to 1649, there is a civil war in England between the forces of the king and the forces of Parliament. Civil wars are civil wars. They're fighting each other. Okay, and here are the two sides. Okay, the royalists or the cavaliers that supported Charles. They were large landowners, aristocrats. Okay, the parliamentarians, those that supported Parliament, called the Roundheads, they were members of the House of Commons. They were Puritans, more townspeople, and what results is a civil war. The Civil War does not go very well for Charles. Okay, one of the major reasons is the Puritan forces. The Puritan forces or the parliamentarian forces are led by this guy, Cromwell. Cromwell is really the military genius of this time period. He creates Parliament's new model army. It's really a force that is more, I guess, infantry than anything, more people involved. They used firearms, they used gunpowder, and they will defeat Charles's forces. Cromwell essentially defeats Charles's forces and becomes the most important person in England. For a while, it seems like the Civil War is not going to go well for Charles. And then he gets captured and he'll be put on trial for treason. And in 1649, he is going to be executed. So Charles will be executed in 1649. When that happens, we go into this period of time that's really called the interregnum between the kings. It lasts from 1649 until 1660. The first period is called the Commonwealth, when really Parliament tries to rule. Then it goes so badly that Cromwell will essentially take over and become a military dictator from 1644 until 1660. This is not the best time in England. All right, the king is dead. Cromwell essentially creates in the beginning a constitutional republic, but there's no monarch, but Parliament really doesn't do very well, and basically Cromwell sends the Parliament home and rules essentially as a military dictator. He will crush a rebellion in Scotland. He will fight a major war in Ireland. And really, this is a very brutal time in England as well. After this is over, okay, the English are tired of this, and Cromwell dies in 1658. His son Richard tries to take over. He's terrible, and so the English restore the monarchy in 1660. They bring back Charles I's son, Charles II, and make him king. Now Charles is angry. He is mad because the English have killed his father. He has been abroad. He's actually been living in France. So he's Catholic. He likes Louis XIV. Okay, but he also realizes that he can't come back to England and say, "Well, I'm going to be an absolute monarch." So he plays the game. He plays a very subtle game where he tries to gain power slowly, surely over this 25-year period. He may have been able to really rule by himself by the time you get to 1685, but he dies pretty unexpectedly. During his reign, you have the plague that hits London in 1665, the Great Fire that happens in 1666. The Puritans were convinced that Charles was something evil. They aren't a big fan of him. To make matters worse, he was very pro-French in his foreign policy because he likes Louis XIV. So there were really some major problems. And then he dies unexpectedly. He has no legitimate children, so his brother James becomes king. And when that happens, James is thoroughly Catholic. He has a son in 1688 that he baptizes Catholic, and he alienates Parliament, alienates everyone, and they're determined to get rid of him. But rather than fight a civil war, okay, by the way, you can kind of read some of this stuff. He is very, very pro-Catholic, and that's going to cause him to get booted out. Okay. In 1688, the Parliament goes out and finds William of Orange, who is the leader of the Netherlands. He is married to James's daughter, Mary. They invite him essentially to invade England and boot out James II, which is what he will do. He is Protestant. He hates Louis XIV. So he will invade England. Parliament recognizes him. He boots James out, and he becomes the next king. When he does, he signs this. The English Bill of Rights is so important because William decided that he would sign this. Okay, it creates the constitutional monarchy in England. It is the model for the U.S. Bill of Rights. It is the thing that makes England a constitutional monarchy. It says things like this: the king cannot suspend the operation of laws. The king cannot make law without Parliament's consent. The king cannot levy taxes without Parliament's consent. Freedom of speech in Parliament. Okay, sessions of Parliament will be held frequently. Okay, so freedom from arbitrary arrest, censorship of the press was dropped. So these freedoms are part of the English Bill of Rights and creates the constitutional monarchy in England, a limited monarchy. The English will never embrace an absolute monarchy. They reject it twice, once with the English Civil War and once with the Glorious Revolution. So this is a very different system, one that limits the power of the monarch. Make sure that you know the difference between what's going on in England and what's going on in France and the rest of Europe with the development of absolute monarchy. This is a big deal. You'll see it on the exam. So make sure you understand the differences between these two systems.